It's so good to see you guys this morning and be able to share with you all. If you're kind of visiting us today, or you haven't been for a while, then it's worth saying we're in the middle of a series, Back to Your Future, a plug on the 80s film, but nothing related to it. But we've been looking over the last few weeks about how God has a future for us. And Luke kicked the series off by talking about how that future starts now. Not tomorrow, starts now, and how we should be aiming to enter into God's best for us today. And then Leah followed on last week by talking about building strong foundations and how you kind of get there, how you set yourself up, if you like, for your future. And our topic this morning is looking at the idea of talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. And I thought I'd start the message with an interesting question, which you don't get asked every Sunday. And that's this: who's ever been threatened? Anybody? Yeah, a few people. Yeah, that's good. Good. I've been threatened too, a couple of times over the years. My job is kind of an occupational hazard. For those of you who don't know, I work with people who have various mental health issues, people who suffer from substance misuse and addictions, and occasionally, when people aren't in the right frame of mind, they can perhaps react in a way or say things that they don't really mean, but it just comes out because they're angry. And I remember the first time it happened. I'd probably been in the job about 2 or 3 weeks, and this guy came down for an interview for accommodation and was looking for a place to stay, and we were talking to him, and he came in, and right from the get-go, he was kicking off about things, and I got the phone call to come down and speak to him, and no matter what we tried to do, we just couldn't get him to kind of calm down, and he'd been threatening staff, and in the end, like I said to him, look, mate, we're not going to interview you, well, you kind of like this, you're being really aggressive, it doesn't bode well, for us giving you a place to live when you're living with 54 other people, let alone the staff. And so we kind of said, come back tomorrow in the morning when you've calmed down, we'll have a chat with you, we'll do whatever we can to help you. But he didn't take that well, surprise, surprise. So then he started to say to me, don't you know you can be followed home? Those kind of things. Bit sinister. But I think I knew he didn't really mean it. And then a few months ago, we had this other guy who was very similar, was very, very aggressive. And actually, we got him a house, we got him a place to live, but that was clearly our fault, and we shouldn't have done that. And he got right in my face and was really horrible. I really thought he was going to hit me. And but then, I think, he just kind of pulled back from the edge. But I think, the thing is, it's easier sometimes to say it than it is to follow through. And kind of words come easy sometimes for us. And but following through on the action requires commitment, particularly when it has legal ramifications. And I was thinking about who's been on the other side of it, who's threatened somebody. Like this morning even, your kids, your spouse. I don't do that, obviously. But, I was thinking about this. It's like part of everyday life. Sometimes we threaten people in a loving way just to kind of affect some kind of action. So I'm like, if you don't eat your tea, something bad's going to happen. And, and in the same way, sometimes, maybe your spouse, if I come in and one sock is on the floor again and it's not been put in the basket, I don't know who's experienced that. Say yes and amen. I don't know if that's been you. But I think normally we, those kind of things are used to affect some kind of action. And, really the world is looking for action when it comes to the church. How many of you believe that? The world isn't looking for a church that talks the talk and it has got a really good language. It's looking for a church that's prepared to put the money where the mouth is. See, actions speak louder than words. People don't remember your words, but they'll remember your actions a lot of the time. And, whilst we're here this morning at church, the reality is, while we're having a nice time worshiping Jesus, hanging out together, drinking good coffee, there are people outside of these walls whose marriages are breaking down, who are struggling with all kinds of health issues, physical health, mental health issues, people trapped in loneliness and isolation, looking for a way out, desperate for somebody to walk into their life, to offer friendship, to offer connection. That's happening this morning. And it's so easy sometimes to come into this building and think, this is it. But this isn't it. The world needs action. Talk is easy though, right? We can talk a good game. Even this morning as I'm speaking, it's easy for me to say these things. But when we leave this room and the rubber hits the road and we have to follow through with our commitments, that requires dedication. That requires commitment. And the Bible talks about this whole idea of talk is cheap, putting your money where your mouth is. And we're going to look at a scripture together now. If you want to open up your Bible or turn your phone on, whichever you're using this morning, we're going to look at a couple of verses together from James chapter 2. James chapter 2. Many of you will be familiar with this passage. It's a good one. I mean, it's all good, anyway, but, certain bits particularly. But we're going to look at James chapter 2. 14 to 18, just a couple of verses together. And James writes this, he says in James 2:14, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is that? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, 'Well, you've got faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds.'" That's a challenging passage when you think about what we're called to do as people who follow Jesus. We're not saved by things we do. We don't believe that God kind of looks at our actions and thinks, "Okay, you're good enough." We're saved by Jesus. And Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was saved by grace. But that grace should move us to action. The love of God should stir something up in us that affects change. The gospel literally means good news. It should be something we want to share. St. Francis of Assisi once said this, I think it's going to come up on the screen. He said, "Preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words." Preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Jesus himself in Matthew 25 was asked about, the kingdom of heaven and how does it work and what's it going to be like when we kind of stand before our Maker. And Jesus uses an illustration of sheep and goats, and he basically talks about people who are going to get in, if you like, make it into heaven, and people who aren't going to get in. And he uses an interesting illustration. He says this: "The king will say to those on his right, 'Enter, you will blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you in your kingdom. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation. And here's why. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you gave me a room. I was shivering, and you gave me some clothes. I was sick, and you stopped to visit. I was in prison, and you came to me." And the Bible goes on to talk about how, the disciples said to him, "Well, when did, in the illustration, when did we do that?" And Jesus responds by saying this: "When you did it for the least of these among you, you did it for me." And the truth is, when we show the love of God to others, it's as if it's an act of worship. It's a way that we show our love to Jesus. And that's how he looks at it. You see, we're looking at this series in the life groups, Love Does. And that statement is so true. If we love Jesus, then love does. Faith and works, they go together. When people see the love of Jesus in action, then they'll be interested maybe in what we have to say. But until that time, we're just good talkers, really, aren't we? And I was thinking about this morning, and we haven't got a lot of time together today, but I thought, well, okay, most of us are going to sit there and think, well, yeah, you're right, love does. We should be doing stuff. But, there's all these kind of challenges. Life is busy. Maybe it's about a lack of resource. Maybe it's the fact that, you feel like, well, at my stage in life, I'm not well enough to be out there doing loads of things. I've had my time, maybe. Maybe it's, more a case of physically you're not well enough. There's all these reasons why we can kind of excuse ourselves, why we can't be doers. And so, we just kind of talk the talk. We encourage people verbally, but we don't really go as much as we should. And I thought, really, how do we get there? Well, it's pretty simple. It's three things I want to talk about this morning that we can do, if you like, to be people who are moved to a more of a mindset of doing than talking. And they're really simple things. They're going to, in fact, it's pretty straightforward stuff. But these three things, I think, if we all did this every day, then we would see a real transformation in the church. And it's simply this: have a heart, see a need, meet the need. Complicated, right? Have a heart, see the need, meet the need. You know, in the time I've got left, which is about 20 minutes, I want to tell you about some friends of mine who have really kind of took this idea on of being people who are doers, and they've stood in the gap for others. And I'm not saying that because these people are examples any more than some of the people in this room are examples, but I think sometimes when we think about where people started from before they get to their point where God elevates their ministry, I think sometimes it can be interesting to track it back to how it all began. And I want to really tell you about a couple of people, and hopefully through these people you can see how it's not rocket science. That love does, faith and works go together, and really it just comes back to these things of us individually making a commitment to have a heart, to let God work in our hearts, to see the needs around us, and to do something about meeting those needs. And the first person I want to talk about is a guy called Dave Cook. Now, you might know the name Dave Cook. I don't know if anybody, that name resounds with you. Dave Cook was the guy who started what's called the Shoebox Appeal, Operation Christmas Child. Has anybody ever sent a box to Romania or somewhere else? Yeah, quite a few people. Well, Dave was the guy who started that, and I was privileged to work with Dave, like some years ago when I was on a gap year, and I worked for Samaritan's Purse as kind of an office intern. I'd just finished my A-levels, and I was kind of just looking for something really to not fill my time, but to put me in a different headspace where I could figure out what God was doing in my life and where he was taking me to. And Dave was a good friend of my dad's. In fact, Dave was instrumental in my dad coming back to faith. But that's another story. But I got to work with this guy, Dave Cook, and I don't know how much people know about him, but Dave is a guy who, before he was in charge of the Shoebox Appeal, was a long-distance lorry driver. And basically what he did was, he just used to drive trucks. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a pastor. He went to church and stuff, but he was just a normal guy living in Wrexham, doing his thing, going in to work every day. He had a family. And what happened was one night he was sat there watching the 6 o'clock news. And this piece came on the news about these orphans in Romania who literally had nothing. They'd been abandoned, they'd been left in these orphanages, that they weren't going to have Christmas. Christmas was approaching at that time. All the adverts had started, the John Lewis advert was on, all that kind of thing. And Dave was sat there watching this, surrounded by his family, and he had three or four little kids, and it just broke his heart to see these children on the other side of the world who, for no other reason than they were in a different country, would have a totally different experience of Christmas than his own children. He felt moved that he needed to do something. And at that point when that happens in your life, there's a number of options you can take. So, you can kind of go to your pastor about it and say, Lord, can you pray about this for me, pastor? Or you can do something about it. Sometimes you don't need to pray about things. You just need to do something about a need that's around you. And Dave decided what he was going to do is he was going to get one of his lorries from work and he was going to fill them with some shoe boxes. And he encouraged people in the local area, put some word out there that you were going to fill these boxes and they're going to take him over to the children. And by himself, he took his lorry over to Romania and he gave out the boxes. And now Operation Christmas Child delivers hundreds of thousands of boxes every year all over the world to children. But that started from one guy having a heart and doing something about it. It started from a regular guy who had no ministerial qualification. He wasn't someone who'd been to Bible college. He wasn't someone who'd been slain in the spirit and totally, transformed by the presence of God. He was a guy who wanted to put his faith into action and was stirred that if he believed in this Jesus who gave everything for him, then maybe he could do something for someone who didn't have very little. And what happened with Dave was over the years, as he was more and more involved with the Shoebox Appeal, he actually started a bunch of other projects. See, that's the interesting thing about God. When God sees that you're prepared to stand in the gap for someone, often he opens your eyes to more gaps. Jesus talked about that. He talked about how those who've been trusted and can prove that they've been trusted will be given more. When we start stepping out in faith, God gives us more. When he knows that we can be trusted with things. But, he was just a normal guy who did something about a need, and the world followed. That could be you this morning. Could have been you watching the 6 o'clock news. Could have been you. What would you have done? He was just a regular guy, like I say. And I want to talk about someone else now who similarly saw a need as well, and that's my friend Becky. And Becky is related to the Shaw family over here, Becky Murray, who runs the charity One by One with her husband Matt, who Janine's been on mission with a bunch of times. And the story there is very similar. You see, what happened was Becky was a young girl and decided she was wanting to get closer in a relationship with God and decided to go off to Sierra Leone on a mission trip. She felt like she wanted to get something experienced, so off she went. While she's out there, she met a little girl called Felicity, and this girl was coming to their programs, and she decided, well, I want to treat this little girl. She noticed she had no shoes, so she bought her a 20p pair of flip-flops from the market. And that week, they were having a concert at the church, and so she invited her to come to the hotel, because that was where the bus was leaving from, and they were going to give her the flip-flops, and they were going to go off to the concert. And when she arrived and she gave her these flip-flops, 20p flip-flops, this little girl was so overwhelmed. But she said something to Becky that was really strange. She said, "Oh, thank you so much. Shall I go to your room?" And Becky said, "Well, no, the bus is going now. We're off to a concert." She said, "Okay, so when we come back, shall I go to your room?" She said, "No, when we come back, it'll be late. It's time to go home then, we're late." So this little girl stopped and said, "Well, so when do you want me to go to your room?" And the penny eventually dropped with Becky that what this little girl was saying was, "You've bought me something, I owe you something back." And what she thought at 9 years old was that meant her body. Now, can you imagine what's happened to a 9-year-old girl? My oldest daughter is 8. That thinks that their body isn't worth 20 pence. You can't imagine it, can you? And what happened was that story stuck with Becky, and she's like, children shouldn't have to be brought up in that world. I'm going to do something about it. And so she started a children's home. And I can tell you more about the story, but the time is kind of going to go on us. But now, through the work that her and her husband do, they not only have a children's home in Kenya where they kind of house 80 or so kids who would be absolute orphans if it wasn't for them taking them in. They have a community feeding program, which, feeds hundreds more children. They're involved with the schools ministry, which reaches about 10,000 children a week. And then they have these other projects across the globe where they raise awareness for anti-human trafficking and all these things. But really, it all came back to her having a heart, to seeing a need, and to making a commitment to meet the need. You see, that's the thing that makes a difference in the lives of people. You see, it's not how eloquent we are when we come to preach. It's not how hot our worship is. It's not how amazing our buildings are that encourages people to see the love of God. It's when we stand in the gap for somebody else. It's when we are bothered to come out of our little Christian bubble and move away from our religious meetings. And when we see somebody in desperate need and we think, that person needs the love of God, I can do that for them. It's having a heart. It's seeing a need. It's meeting the need. Love does. Faith and works, they go together. You can't separate them out. When people see the love of God in action, then they'll be drawn to what we have to say. But if they don't see that, then don't be surprised if they're not asking you questions about your faith. In the Bible, in the book of Amos, it's an interesting book, but in Amos chapter 5, God addresses the Israelites, and he says to them, he's kind of really giving them a good ticking off, if you read that chapter. And some of the words are very strong. So God says things like, I despise your religious feasts. Away with the noise of your songs. When you bring me offerings, I will not accept them. And when you think about that, you think, well, that sounds a bit harsh, God. What's wrong with our songs? What's wrong with our offerings? But what God says is really interesting in that book, and you can read it. It says simply this: because you neglect the poor and the broken among you. That's why he's angry at them. You see, this is not just a thing that is a good 21st century church idea, reaching out to people. This is the heart of God, everybody. This is what God wants us to do. In the book of Micah, Micah says, what does the Lord require of you? To love justice, to love and to love mercy. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. In James 1:27, the Bible says this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. It's interesting how the Bible doesn't say religion that God accepts as pure and faultless is this. That's the most relevant expression of Jesus. That's the most shiny expression of whatever. It's all about meeting a need. And this series that we're doing about Back to the Future, we're doing it because we believe God has got needs he wants you to meet. Yeah? As a church, we're all in this together, right? So this isn't just an idea that we're saying as a church, we want to do more. We do want to do more. But actually, we believe God has got more for you. And you've all got gifts in this room that are different and are unique expressions of the grace and the goodness of God. And you should be using those things to meet the needs around you. You see, we want to be a church that releases people to stand in the gap for others. We want to be a church that encourages its members to see wider than this room, to see what God's doing outside of this room. This Sunday morning thing that we do, really, it's just a pit stop on the way to Monday. Faith and works go together. Love does. You might not be called to start kind of an international ministry this morning, but you're called to have a heart. You're called to see people's needs. You're called to meet the needs. What burden has God put in your heart? Who's around you right now whose needs you can meet? Going back to One by One, my wife has done a couple of trips with them. She supports them doing various things and whatever else. And that was a long process. I mean, if you ask her about it, she'll tell you, but she had a period of time where she knew God was stirring something up in her heart. And it was a real season of frustration for her. And she wanted to be doing more. She wanted to be doing more for God. She had this thing that she kept saying to me. She's like, I don't just want to be this, some 45-year-old Christian sitting on a chair not doing anything with my life. That was what came out of that. And, the whole thing that she does now with One by One, it came out of frustration. We need to learn to be fruitful in our frustration. We need to learn to make our moaning our passion. It's not enough to just get stuck in a rut where we're fed up and we're upset and whatever else. Let's use that to go out of these walls and meet the needs of people around us. It's not rocket science. Have a heart, see a need, meet the need. Love does, faith and works, they go together. Allow God to work on your heart, position yourself to see the needs around you, and then do something about them. I want to start to draw this to a close right now. But I want to make a statement, really. And I believe that as a church, I believe healthy things grow. How many people believe that? Yeah? So I'm not interested in building a big church because I want to build a brand. I believe that if we're doing right things, God is going to add to our number. That's what happened in the early church, right? But I believe genuinely that we'll grow as we go. We will grow as we go. And what I mean by that is that mission and evangelism should be at the heart of everything we do. Now, when I say mission, I'm not just talking about going out to Africa or going out to India. I'm talking about mission in the idea of reaching others for Jesus. Where you are in the settings that God's put you in, they should be at the heart of everything you do. And you can sit there and think, well, I'm not an evangelist. I'm not a missionary. That's not who God has made me to be. Maybe not. Maybe he hasn't called you to have that ministry, but he has called you to have that mindset. He wants you to understand that you were made for more than coming to a church meeting. You were made for more than being a religious person who ticks a spiritual box in your life by going to church and being part of a church. God has a plan for you. He has a future for you. And he has people who are in desperate need of you. And I want to throw out a bit of a gauntlet right now. Simply that in the past, maybe as a church, we've not been good at endorsing everybody's individual things. We've not celebrated maybe the different ministries people in our congregation are involved with. I was talking to Luke about this, and we want to say as a leadership team, that if you're involved in something that meets the needs of others, if you're involved in standing in the gap, then we want to celebrate with you. We want to change that round. No longer are we going to kind of have this mindset where, okay, if something is only officially recognized by Sheffield Christian Life Centre, that's what gets talked about on the platform. If you're meeting a need, we're going to celebrate it in this church. Right, we're going to do that. Right, wherever God's called you to go, whatever your thing is, we might not be able to financially support it. We might not be able to kind of give you half an hour to share on it, but we want to celebrate it with you. If you're stepping out in faith for God, we want to pray for you. We want to encourage you, because we know that the more people who go outside and take this on board, loving others, reaching others for Jesus, will grow as we go. Each one of us, and we're all called to go. You know, guys, you can come up if you want. I think I'm just about there. Ed, you can put the atmospheric music on. It's often been said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Anybody believe that? When they know that you care, then they might be interested in what you have to say. Love does. Faith and works go together. You know, if you're not in a life group, I really want to encourage you to get to this Bob Goff series that we're doing. It kind of takes this on in a much more articulate way than I can do it on Justice on a Sunday morning. But you know, we're thinking about our future this morning, and God has a plan for you that's going to move you from a place of being a really good talker to being someone who's able to meet the needs of those around you. Imagine if we all did this, right? Imagine if as a church this morning we took that on. It's this idea that, you know what, this week I'm going to meet somebody's needs. I'm going to have a heart. I'm going to see the needs around me. I'm going to do something about them. You know what, I'm not a prophet or anything like that, but I can guarantee you would have some interesting conversations with your work colleagues, with your neighbors, with the people that you just maybe randomly bless. Because this is not a value that the world is really doing a lot of. You know, there's pockets of really good work all over the world, and a lot of that isn't even church work, but the fact of the matter is that the more needs we meet, the more people we're able to show the love of God to. And that's what we're called to do, right? We're not just called to be in this building talking about church, we're called to be the church outside of these walls.